This article was the completion of a research he had started in 1962 when he was working on his PhD in London. It was called The Seal of Solomon the Scribe. I had been intrigued by the suggestion he made in his last study, which alas I could not discuss with him anymore, but they stood as a kind of scholarly testament. I kept, in reading it, remembering one of the many things he taught us. No research is ever final. 100 fois sur le métier, tu remettras ton ouvrage. In the 18th century. Following a few thoughts I have already presented, I wish to offer here, as an homage of fervent memory to our teacher and mentor, a more developed reflection on two images of the so-called Albenk Pentateuch. A manuscript kept in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and dated 1340. It was written and illuminated in the Dauphiné area of the south of France by Shlomo Bar Eliezer Chaim HaKohen. He writes his name, he signs his name. The commentary, mainly based on Rashi and the Tosafist, is accompanied by pen drawings outlined and shaped as a classical Carmina figurata. They illustrate and decorate the text and differ totally from the 13th-14th century micrography about which you heard yesterday. On folio 32 verso, there is an illustration of Genesis 28:12-18, Jacob's dream of the ladder, which I recently published. Narkiss remarks, the artist sometimes added pictorial allusions that do not appear in either text and point to this deep knowledge of the Jewish text. Among these, for example, is a tetramorph cherub with a human face on top of the ladder in Jacob's dream, alluding to the verse, and behold, the Lord stood above him. In order to avoid representing an image of God, Shlomo depicted one of the tetramorphs that, according to Ezekiel 1, carry the throne of God. The ladder, as you can see, has 5 rungs, shaped by the Carmina figurata text of the commentary, and outlined by a pen-drawn line. The lowest rung is ending by a curved line, of which emerge 2 feet, here, 2 feet, and here is the creature on top of the ladder. The ladder is inscribed twice. This is a ladder, ze sulam. On top of the ladder, a human head is drawn in the middle of 8 wings, from which 2 feet emerge. 2 wings are joined over the head of the creature, 2 others over the feet. A pair of open wings emerges upward to the right and the left, another pair downwards in the same movement. The depiction owes nothing to the biblical text. He dreamed, and behold, a ladder set upon earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. You have the text in Hebrew here. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood above him, and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your seed. And Jacob awoke out of his sleep, and he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how full of awe this place is. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Narkiss is intrigued by the depiction of folio 32, which is far from being parallel to contemporary miniatures depicting Jacob's ladder. But he is not aware that a particular depiction of this scene, with a little creature with 8 wings on top of the page, can only be explained by a little margin pen drawing in the manuscript. In joining Jacob's letter with a margin drawing, their meaning can be revealed. And this is our purpose today. To refer to the angels in the story, the text of Genesis in Hebrew uses the word malachim, and the Greek version of the Septuagint, angeloi. The meaning is the same, envoy, messenger. The angelic creature is a link between the divine and the human world created by God. It has specific tasks to accomplish, specific roles to play. Different kinds of angels are described by the Bible, but we should be aware, already at this time, that there is no precise depiction of the angels in the dream of the ladder, a part of the fact they climbed up and down. On the upper register of the east wall of the Dura or synagogue, on your left, two human-looking figures without wings stand quite awkwardly on the side of the low ladder. The Via Latina 4th century catalogue on your right, which may partly be of Jewish influence, shows the same non-winged human figures, one of which is climbing down. There is no depiction of this narrative in the Jewish iconography from the 4th to the 15th century. The mosaic pavements of the synagogues discovered until this day do not picture the scene, nor does anything exist in any other media. To find again these angels after the 4th century, we need to turn to early medieval Christian iconography, of which the Byzantine Octaturks are the best witnesses. There is a physical connection between the written word and the text, and the image which illustrates it. The text of the Septuaginta and patristic commentaries show angels with wings and halos rising to a bust of Jesus Logos, bearded and hollow, raising a blessing hand towards them. In the Latin word, the translation of the Bible into Latin, the Salerno ivory, which comes now, and the Mishnah Genesis see the angels arriving toward the Christian Creator. The 12th century Romanesque Lambeth Bible brings together on a full page Abraham et Mamre, the sacrifice of Isaac, and Jacob's dream. The Christian connotations of the three scenes are of course typological, basing Christological commentaries on biblical architecture. On one side, the Annunciation of Mary for Abraham et Mamre, Jesus' passion for the sacrifice of Isaac, and his resurrection are to be understood through the Genesis narrative. On the side of Jacob's ladder, three angels, recalling the Trinity, climb towards an enormous bust of Jesus, who holds a long roll on which is written, Ego sum Deus betel. This is a quote from Genesis 31, from the dream of the ladder, Ani ha'el shel betel. The name Jacob gave to the place he heard God's voice is rooted in medieval Christian theology to ecclesia, the Christian church, the true house of God. Obviously, the Christian iconography of the dream of Jacob is preoccupied quite uniquely by the connection between the angelic creatures and Christological typology. Out of this interpretation, Jewish medieval iconography chooses a different emphasis. Far from using and copying a well-known Christian model, Jewish art wishes to reinterpret the narrative. Aware of what could be called outside trends, it follows its own ideas and messages. 14th century Haggadot, of which I will choose 3 examples only, show angels everywhere, double-winged, beautiful creatures dressed in white tunics. In the Golden Haggadah, which you see here, 3 angels move inside the miniature as a fourth arrive on the top of the ladder, where the heavens open on the framed face of another winged angel. Far from being an anthropomorphic depiction of God, as in the parallels of Christian art, this detail is related to a midrashic addition to the narrative. The angels saw the face of Jacob on the divine throne and climbed up to contemplate him, on Bereshit Rabbah 73. Catherine Kojman-Appel, in her article on the scales in the Leipzig Mazel, refers also to an additional medieval midrash, Shekel Tov, which reads as follows: Rabbi Chia Rabbah and Rabbi Yanai, one says they stepped up and down on the ladder and left him. The other says they stepped up and down in order to stay next to Jacob, in order to see him whose image is engraved on the upper sphere. They stepped up and down and saw the fourth creature on the throne of glory, whose name is like his, Israel, and then they stepped down and found him sleeping. We'll have to remember that midrash a little later on. The so-called Sister Haggadah replaces the Christian cruciform haloed figure with a double human face, male and female, as the biblical cherubim hovering over the ark. They represent the duality of creation. But the most striking depiction appears in the Sarajevo Haggadah. One angel is climbing up, raising an outstretched hand towards a cloud in the sky. The other, getting down, is turned towards Jacob. Both angels are closing their long wings over their faces, totally covering them in one easy and elegant movement. The angels are not hiding their faces to remain remote from vision. They hide their eyes, coming up and down from heaven, like Moses, having spoken to God, veiled his face. They face the divine and are unable to look at him. As opposed, very clearly, to the incarnate vision of the Christian divinity, there is no doubt here about the polemical implications of the depictions of the angels within the dialectical Judeo-Christian visual dialogue. But we have to come back to the Arabic Pentateuch. The depiction of folio 32b is far from the text and from the examples we have just seen. The attention is called on 2 details. Jacob does not appear at all in the drawing, and the main emphasis is on the ladder, frontal and flat, on which no angel is climbing. The ladder standing on earth, like it is written, has feet, 2 long rectangles pointing to the right and to the left. Are those the feet of the ladder, or do they suggest human stylized feet? They recall the famous miniature of the Book of Kells, however it's not the same subject, portraying John with his feet widely apart on 2 sides of the seat. It's not the same period, it's not the same subject, of course it's not a model for our Pentateuch. But is the image suggesting the Merkavah, the throne of God, on top of the ladder, which is part of the Midrashic explanations? Narkiss concludes, since these creatures have the task of bearing God's throne and glorifying Him, our image may represent one of the angels who carried his throne, taking the place of God on top of the ladder. The 8-winged and human-faced creature on top of the ladder may so, perhaps, take the place of God. Who is this hybrid depiction? Nowhere in the Arabic Pentateuch are there 8-winged angels like this one. In the 2 sacrifice of Isaac's little margin scenes, one in Genesis and the other in Leviticus, as well as in the figuration of Jacob resting with the angel, which we'll see immediately. They all have 2 wings, and only 2 wings, pointed upwards. Narkiss uses 3 different words to depict the 8-winged angel on top of the ladder: tetramorph, cherub, and angel. But he uses tetramorph and cherub in the same sentence without a comma between them. So it's for him one category. They characterize 3 different biblical creatures, and they cannot be taken as similar in form or meaning. Jewish angelology refers indeed to 3 main categories of angels based on the biblical text. Cherubim, as in Exodus 31, stood on the 2 sides of the Kaporet, the cover of the Ark of Covenant in the tabernacle, and later in the first temple. There are no depictions of the tabernacle cherubs in early Jewish art, unless we can count the birds or the Roman gold glasses. Maybe Rivka will agree with that or not. Or the 2 sides of the ark in the mosaic of Bet Alpha. The St. Petersburg First Pentateuch, and you all know these images, depicts them as leaves over the frame of the ark. The opening page of the Sephardi Bible from the end of the 13th and 14th century are the first one to depict cherubim with wings and human heads, but they are inscribed, cherubim hovering with their wings over the Kaporet. This very hesitant depiction is aware of the difficulty in representation of creatures that, like the ark itself, were not to be seen, and whose depiction in the Bible is lacking precision. The depiction of the Albin Pentateuch is surely not a cherub. Seraphim are part of the vision of the Merkava, the divine throne in Isaiah 6. They have 6 wings, 2 of them covering their face, 2 covering their feet, and with 2 wings they fly. There are 6 winged creatures with a face and feet, maybe the feet are here, standing before the throne of God to glorify him. But they are not the creature we see. The first chapter of Ezekiel relates a vision of the divine throne by the prophet. Inside the fiery chashmal, 4 creatures, the chayot, appear to him. The overall appearance of each is of a man with 4 faces: the face of a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a human face. The chayot have 4 wings, 2 upwards and 2 downwards, covering their bodily features. This difficult and complicated vision has been adopted by Christian art very early, and the tetramorph, translated already from the text of the Apocalypse 4 by Irenaeus, into the 4 evangelists and their symbols. Here, as you can see them in the ceiling of the Sancta Sanctorum of the Vatican Palace. Each of them is one of those 4 creatures. One of the chayot holds a book and has 2 wings. Looking more closely at the pen drawing by Shlomo the scribe, one has to admit that on top of the ladder, what is drawn is not a 2-winged cherub, not a 6-winged seraph, not a 4-winged tetramorph. What do the 8 wings stand for? Can we penetrate the world of the scribe and find our way towards an explanation of his intentions and the meaning of the figuration? You remember that yesterday the Dean of Jewish Studies, Professor Elia Rodov, told us to search for the meaning of the Jewish art figurations. The well-known miniatures that you know also of the Byzantine Christian topography and of the Octateuchs indeed depict over the Ark of Covenant the 2 cherubim as tetramorphs. This Christian interpretation of the biblical motif has been amply detailed by recent research. Suffice be to remark that they have 4 wings and not 8, and they differ totally from the depiction of angels in the figurations of the dream of Jacob. The 9th century Sacra Paralela. No, I'm sorry, I went too quickly. Let's come back. No, parallella seem to have gone away. Here, I'm sorry. The 9th century Sacra Parallela shows the vision of Isaiah, with Jesus sitting on an elaborated throne before which stand 2 6-winged creatures, each with a human face and feet coming out of the wings. The Book of Kings miniature, now we go back, it's okay, shows the ark on its way to Jerusalem and offer also the same illustration. On the chariot, there is not a cherub, but a creature with wings covering its bodily prized parts. The homily of Jacob Kokino-Barfos depicts hovering over a transparent ark 2 6-winged creatures with human faces, which will be very close in the movement of their wings to the Albec Pentateuch, were it not for the additional pair of wings. In the London Hebrew Miscellany, 2 6-winged angels, look at them, how beautiful they are, this time full-bodied, over the ark, and multicolored. And over the ark in the Regensburg Pentateuch, they are already switched to little birds with wings and pointed heads. There is no parallel to Shlomo's drawing. To find an answer to the riddle offered by this intriguing miniature, we have to go back to the manuscript itself. On folio 216 of the Albec Pentateuch, there is a little margin drawing, and I'm sorry for the pictures I couldn't get in time, the pictures from the Oxford Library. So they show an hexagram inscribed in a round medallion held by a hand. It is inscribed the seal of Solomon the king, Chotam Shlomo HaMelech. The Talmud in Tractate Gittin 68a and b recalls that Solomon possessed a seal ring on which the name of God was engraved. Of course, we have to remember that Solomon is also the name of the scribe of the Albec Pentateuch. The connection between the geometric form of the 7-pointed star and its meaning follows into the other name of the seal of Solomon, Magen David, based on Psalm 18 and connected to one of the early blessings of the Haftarah. It is an euphemism for the name of God and his protective presence. Used extensively, as you all know, in Mesopotamia and India very early, the hexagram appeared in the early centuries of Jewish architectural decoration, and you remember its appearance in Kfar Nahum and in many Hebrew medieval manuscript illumination, as early as 1010. In one of the first remaining examples of decorated biblical text, and again, thanks to the research of Narkiss, on folio 474 of the St. Petersburg, once called Leningrad Codex, a full page shows an hexagram written in micrography, which includes among the verses used in the words, "Look down from your holy habitation from heaven." The hexagram is a metaphor for the divine presence, and miniatures, I'll give you some examples, of Jewish manuscripts such as the Copenhagen Pentateuch or the Duke of Sussex Ashkenazi Pentateuch make use of it. This use was obviously well known to Solomon the scribe. But again, how does it explain the figuration on top of the ledger? The wings of the 8-winged creature on top of the ledger are symbols of the divine, essentially and uniquely destined to have specific Jewish connotation. Not only did Shlomo know the Christian depictions, he avoided them carefully. The example of the Monreale seraph with 6 wings brings to mind a clear reference to the cross. And so do many similar depictions in Christian art. To avoid this Christian reference, in figuring the creature on top of the ladder Merkava, Shlomo chose to refer formally to the seal of Solomon, thus emphasizing his own name and at the same time justifying the addition of a new pair of wings to attain the geometry of the hexagram, the meaning of which was obvious for him and his patrons. He could, by doing so, not only erase the Christian reference to the cross, as was done, for example, by adding a fifth branch to the four-branched order crossing of the vault of the Altneu Shul in Prague, but a strange drawing on top of the ladder in the Albec Pentateuch can only be understood if we follow the intention of the scribe artist. He didn't add a pair of wings for nothing. He wanted to draw the form of the hexagram. It uses the formal frame of Solomon's seal to depict the non-figurable divine on top of the ladder, whom the angels with their wings glorify and of whom they support the throne. The face may be, according to the Midrash, that of Jacob on the Merkava, or the human face of one of the Chayot. They emphasize light not there, but on the deliberate addition of another pair of wings, which brings the drawing back to folio 216, to the sign under which the scribe wishes to put himself, his name, and his inspiration, to the seal of Solomon, the ultimate presence of the non-figurable divinity. Indeed, if our reading is correct, we uncover here, as in other instances already, more and more of the intellectual sophistication of the scribes' illuminators, of their originality of thought, of their knowledge of the outside world, and the ways they dealt with it. Far from copying a model, they elaborated their own language of science, the details of which we are painstakingly trying to decipher a little more at every step. At the same time, we remain deeply indebted to the pioneering and groundbreaking research of our predecessor, whose inspiration is still guiding us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisheva, for most illuminating lecture, double meaning. I mean, also for raising the memory of our beloved teacher. And I'm sure there are many questions. I have quite a few, but we'll wait for the end of the session for the questions. And now I'm honored to invite our next speaker, Professor Annette Weber. And she really is a unique person in our field because she combines or joins together what really is ideally required of a Jewish art scholar, university professor, curator in a museum in the past. She was a curator of the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, and she did some marvelous exhibitions dealing with ceremonial objects, with manuscripts, with Chagall, I mean, like everything that is needed to really to make a round art historian of Jewish art, and a dear friend of any of us. And so her topic will be, we're switching from the research of Jewish art in Israel to Germany, and Annette's topic is the impact of history and politics on the study of Jewish art in Germany. Okay, please. Which is is it this one, the education?
No, this one. Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Thank you very much. It's fine. Just leave it like that. Don't move. No, I would like to have it like that. Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation, and thank you for the
kind introduction, and I hope that you won't be disappointed, because you see I have changed a little bit my subject. I'm starting with an overview about historiography of Jewish art, but then I got caught in the middle, and I wanted to explore or the application of this different concept onto medieval art, of which I'm involved right in the present. And I would like to present you some thought regarding this topic in the second part. As a participant of seminars at the Center for Jewish Art in Jerusalem in the 1980s and the 1990s, I remember that discussion ended up more than once in a heated debate about the definition of Jewish art. No consensus was ever reached, and the question was left to the next seminar. Supposedly, we acted under the spell of artlessness syndrome, to which Common Blunt and Margaret Erlin and others have drawn attention. Following their research, it is agreed by now that the definition of Jewish art has been fraught with preconceptions which were disseminated by philosophers and historians of German Romanticism, such as, due to biblical anachronism, Jews would be incompetent to create fine art and therefore present an uncultured and inferior type of a nation. Moreover, Eva Fromovich has convincingly demonstrated to what an extent politically charged concepts have marked the historiography of Jewish art from the very start, when Julius von Schlosser, David Kaufmann, and David Heinrich Müller published the Sarajevo Haggadah in 1898. She has also shown that members of the first generation of academically trained Jewish art historians, like Ernst Cohn-Wiener and Rachel Wischnitzer, have struggled with the characteristic German exposure of art and culture to politics. In the following, I would like to discuss the repercussions of these concepts in presence in general, and the role of Jewish art in Germany after the Shoah. In a third step, however, I would like to discuss whether Rachel Wischnitzer's approach could contribute towards a new understanding of the development of Jewish art in the Middle Ages. In the later 19th century, the assumption that sovereignty and a nation's specific spirituality would form the core of any art was communis opinio and applied to Jewish art by Martin Buber, Ernst Cohn-Wiener, and others. The result was a hierarchic periodization of Jewish artistic production, which is still prevalent today. Thus, the idea that genuine Jewish spirituality has emerged during the glorious past of a free nation, which felt free to adopt foreign artistic influences and reshape them according to its own cultural needs, has turned Jewish archaeology and ancient art into a field of highly important national and international research. Findings and discussion enjoy worldwide public interest, especially if they could confirm ancient statehood. Yet, from the moment on when Jews lived in the diaspora as a politically dependent minority, artistic expression is regarded as a minor field of Jewish cultural activities. Despite the respectable array of synagogues, mikvaot, and folklore, which still attract considerable research interest. Yet, attention to Jewish art and culture of the early modern period literally dries up, and it has been repeatedly stated that the most deplorable artistic decline has occurred in the so-called age of the ghetto in Ashkenaz, when suppression reigned supreme and art became merely folklore. Subsequently, the exploration of ritual art and material culture of early modern times has remained a field of few specialists. It is also agreed that a new interest in fine art has started with Enlightenment only, and therefore the research of 19th and 20th century Jewish artisan art as well as synagogue architecture is blooming, as these works would attest to successful cultural survival and adaptation as well as Jewish self-assertion in the diaspora. However, Rachel Wischnitzer has already left the discussion of national parameters for Jewish art in 1935. Then, in her last book, Gestalten und Symbole der jüdischen Kunst, published in Berlin in 1935, she shifted the focus from the analysis of formal creativity to iconography and symbolic meaning. She had pre-19th century tradition in mind when she pointed out that rabbinic authorities regarded artistic production with caution throughout the ages. Following an idea of Moritz Steinschneider that art was appropriate if used as a didactic medium for religious education, she decided to create a survey of themes and motifs in Jewish art and represented creative figurative imagination as timeless and enduring because of the strong bonds to a vital Jewish literary tradition and rabbinic exegesis. In choosing this perspective, she probably was marked by the writings of Ismael Bogen, who taught at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums at the same time as herself and revalued the specific importance of literary tradition and creativity for the development of Jewish prayer and liturgy. However, her deliberate turn to tradition might have had political reasons as well, because one could regard it as a form of cultural resistance against the growing defamation of Jews by Nazi Germany, and in doing so, she followed a well-established model of Jewish reaction in the face of crisis. The persecution, expulsion, and finally the annihilation of European Jewry by German Nazism has extinguished Jewish art historical research in Germany. After World War II, the perspective on Jewish art changed fundamentally when the German non-Jewish public discovered Jewish material culture as a way to grapple with the Shoah. Subsequently, Jewish artifacts were exploited as monuments and memorials under the wings of the so-called reconciliation, Wiedergutmachung. Thus, the first exhibition of Judaica in Germany after World War II, the so-called Synagoga exhibition, was held in Recklinghausen in 1960-61 under the patronage of the President of the German Federal Republic and was explicitly set up to improve political contacts between Israel and Germany. Accordingly, exhibited objects was presented as memorials of a noble yet fictional past, as testimonials of a Christian-Jewish harmony. 2 years later, the even more elaborate show of Monumenta Judaica, the title is very telling, in Cologne attempted a similar goal and assembled more than 2,200 objects in order to document the importance of the now lost German Jewish heritage, albeit they didn't draw too much attention of the exhibition of 1925, which was literally held on the same topic and was organized by Adolf Kober and Elisabeth Moses. Moreover, this show aimed also to fight back the newly emerging anti-Semitism and therefore devoted an entire part to the history of Jewish-Christian relations since the Middle Ages. In this context, the existence of Jewish art became a political prerequisite that was no longer discussed. Moreover, there was no audience for this quest any longer. Following the growing impact of the historical research of the Shoah, German civic authorities have started new buildings of Jewish museums since the 1980s and created institutions with no or only minor collections that were set up to educate a predominantly non-Jewish public with the help of installations and reconstruction of a virtual Jewish life. By consequence, artifacts served as corollary historical documentary, but were rarely considered as pure art objects. Parallel to the founding of new Jewish museums, a new search for the remnants of Jewish past was started in urban centers as well as in the countryside, and this stipulated the conservation of cemeteries, synagogues, and other buildings as historical monuments. In all, museums, exhibition, and fieldwork have propelled the recuperation of Jewish material culture and defined research as a way of cultural historical reconstruction of a lost and destroyed Jewish life. In this, however, besides that, it was just Kurt Schubert who drew attention to a new field of research and established a new field when he started to research Jewish folklore. However, in this context, the quest for Jewish art was beyond the interest of most curators and scholars, and this all the more so since it was discovered that the contribution of artists such as Max Liebermann, Jakob Steinhardt, Ludwig Meitner, Otto Freundlich, and Felix Nussbaum, to name but a few, were so important for the development of German art in general that they rendered obsolete any considerations of Jewish incapacity to create and enjoy art. Yet prejudices are persistent, and the rumor of Jewish artlessness lives on, especially when confronted with the fact that Jewish art, up to the 19th century, lacks monumental plastic art. But how could one explain this difference in the development of Jewish art? And this is my next step. In order to tackle these questions, I would like to revert once more to Rachel Wischnitzer's comparative approach of 1935, and especially so as the impact of her research is still notable today. I think that her return to tradition and exclusion of modernity presents a challenge, since it would implicate changing perspectives which do not allow an integral art definition valid at all times and for all communities. Moreover, her observation of rabbinic authorities being concerned with the making of images throughout the ages would implicate a constant discussion of the second commandment, included repeated reevaluation of artistic production, as well as a general ambivalence towards images. And this is attested by many sources to which Vivian Mann has called attention. In this framework, I would like to forward the hypothesis that medieval Judaism redefined its own understanding of art when challenged by Christianity, which propagated a new form of high art. Before discussing Rashi, I would like to resume the attitude of Maimonides, with whom Kalman Bland has dealt extensively. Maimonides, while approving the enjoyment of beautiful artifacts and even fine art for spiritual recreation, nevertheless refuted the making of images for sheer beauty, lest they might entice idolatry. Apparently, the fear of idolatry was so strong that he even forbade to look at churches which he considered to be full of idolatrous images. Obviously, he was a fierce opponent to the new ecclesiastical policy of the 12th century, which favored the use of sculpted images in order to assure and attract Christian believers. Hence, his attitude would point to a clear notion of the limits of artistic production in Judaism because of fear of idolatry. In this case, I guess it's also the conversion to Christianity, but would not prohibit the enjoyment of art and beauty altogether. A century before, Rashi has struggled with the interpretation of the golden calf as man-made by the Israelites. He saw it as a work of Satan, who introduced the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, to request its creation. Thus, the making of the golden calf was not a sin committed by the Israelites proper, and his arguments truly serve to refute contemporary Christian reproach of the Jews being infidels, heretics, and enemies of true faith, an accusation which was to become fatal during the First Crusade. However, Rashi explicitly approved creativity when commenting on the creation of the ritual implements for the tabernacle. He provided even an aesthetic justification for the presence of the flower bulbs on the golden menorah. Velo hayu ba ala lenui. They were there just for beauty. So and this is his comment. And if you know, Rashi is so laconic in his description and comments, and this kind of using the term nui or la nui. This occurs only rarely in his text, and it's tied to the description of the tabernacle, the temple, and the vision of Ezekiel. So it has a very distinct place in his writing, and this is his personal mark about aesthetics. In addition, he related the artistic empowerment of Hiram of Tyrus to the creation itself like a divine gift. This points to a highly appreciative attitude towards art and creating objects, images, with an aesthetic impact. Yet the concession of art and the praise of beauty was reserved for the architecture and ritual implements of the tabernacle and the temple, which were regarded as sacred monuments. Likewise, or in the following, rabbinic authority supported the quest for beauty and art when it came to synagogues and their furnishings and ritual objects, because their aesthetic quality would enhance ritual performance, although single items such as the figurative representation at or in the windows of the synagogue in Cologne, which we have heard yesterday, came under discussion time and again. In other words, the aesthetic power of art objects and architecture was well acknowledged, but considered appropriate only in regard of the ritual. Moreover, as the adornments of the holy, ritual implements were no longer merely decorative, but became monuments in themselves, and this is attested by often elaborate inscription, which we have in synagogues, also on ritual objects. Apparently, medieval rabbinic authorities had clear ideas about the aesthetic impact and purpose of image or creating aesthetics, and therefore restricted their making and use to the realm of the sacred. Nevertheless, they had to adapt the definition time and again, and especially so when challenged from the outside. Until the mid and later 11th century, the Western Christian Church shared the same traditional definition of artistic creativity as derived from the furnishings of the tabernacle and the temple. Therefore, artistic production was likewise confined to the sacred realm and especially to the creation of liturgical objects and manuscripts. In his treatise, De Diversis Artibus, from the first half of the 12th century, Theophilus Presbyter, who was perhaps active in Elmershausen, it's not entirely clear, still qualifies the artists as artifacts bound to follow the model of Bezalel in his creative aims. But attitudes were about to change in the early 12th century when theologians like Huff of St. Victor, teaching in Paris, requested to sculpt human figures in mimesis of nature in order to restore God's own likeness. It's a so-called opus restaurationis. Here, the artifact is no longer an artisan, but an artist whose creative power would enable him to visualize the divine. Art was hailed as an expression of human ingenuity that would transcend the material itself. We have several descriptions by Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis. As it is, and this is inscribed also on the remnants of a golden shrine of 1151, probably created in the Mosaine region, but under the influence of a Paris theology. And it states, Ars auro gemisque prior omnibus auctor. So, art is superseding the gold and the gemstones, but even more so, it is the creative power of the one who conceives it. That is first rate. Since then, art was no longer bound strictly to ritual, but became a medium of transcendency, which served to contemplate the divine with the help of sheer formal qualities. And this, in my eyes, marks the start of monumental fine art in Christianity. However, this was much too close to idolatry, according to Jewish understanding, as there is no transcendency in making images in Judaism and should not be so. It therefore seems to be no coincidence that Jewish warnings against idolatry and the use of images augmented in Ashkenaz since the 12th century, and that human representation in Jewish folklore was discussed by contemporary rabbinic authorities such as the Maharam. One may even ask whether the deliberate facial distortion of the Ambrosianer Bible, the Bird's Head Haggadah, which you see here, and the Masurim from Worms and Leipzig and Hammelburg and others, to name but a few, wasn't there to invert and even mock the attempt of contemporary Christian art to recreate God's own likeness as illicit and inappropriate. It looks as if rabbinic authorities, but also those who decorated ritual books and implements, might have wished to hold up their own understanding of artistic creativity as derived from the Hebrew Bible in order to preserve Jewish life and ritual in moments of crisis and challenge. In conclusion, there is evidence that there existed a genuine Jewish concept of artistic creativity even before the age of emancipation, based on biblical exegesis and rabbinic discussion. When it was challenged by new Christian concepts at the turn of the 11th to the 12th century, which attacked Judaism as heretic and idolatrous, the reaction was a new Jewish artistic production which tackled the arguments visually, but in order to foster ritual tradition. In this context, the art historical quest for a specific style in Jewish art seems to be utterly misplaced. Right the contrary, Jewish authorities were wary of this newly emerging Christian idea as its theological foundation would squarely contradict biblical definition. Therefore, insisting on tradition was deliberate and served to hold up ritual until acculturation started in the Enlightenment. Following this line of argumentation, Rachel Wischnitzer's approach seems to be still helpful in understanding traditional artistic production as long as it was guided by principles transmitted by rabbinic authorities. However, this was no longer valid in the era of Enlightenment, when intellectual parameters changed and the cultivation of a new philosophical idea of aesthetics derived from ancient Greek art became a major factor in civic education, the so-called Bildung. And I wish to draw attention to two portraits of two Jewish personalities, which one can consider as paragon of this new development. It's one on the one side, Moses Mendelssohn, and on the other side it's Henriette Herz. Both portraits were executed by Anton Graf, who, by the way, was the most important artist and painter of the Enlightenment, especially of portraits, and he was commissioned especially the portraits of those involved in this movement. And it's no coincidence in my eyes that the portraits of Moses Mendelssohn was taking in the features of Socrates, as he was compared to be the Socrates, or said to be the Socrates of his age, and that Henriette Herz followed the feature of Juno Ludovisi. It was a very admired ancient or Roman copy of an ancient Greek work in Enlightenment, and this also all the more so since Goethe had it in his individual parlor in his house in Weimar. You see it, the plaster in the background. Here, it's a huge plaster. You see it here. And it's certainly, and also Henriette was praised for her Junonian beauty. So these two portraits transmit explicitly these new aesthetic concepts. And they also, of course, transmit the message that outsiders could turn in an instant by this kind of new intellectual movement to become an intellectual avant-garde in themselves. And I think this was not lost on the emerging Jewish bourgeoisie in its entirety, and led to the emergence of Jewish artists, Jewish collectors, and a new understanding of Jewish art. I thank you very much.
Thanks for very provocative, I would say, ideas that I'm sure many of you have some discussion about them. But now I'm very happy to invite our dear and beloved friend Shulamit Laderman. Shula, as everybody knows her, she's been teaching for many years Jewish art, and she, I think, in her teaching and lectures, brings together, I think, the love of Judaism together with the art, which is, I think, always very fascinating to hear you. She recently published a very important book, Images of Cosmology in Jewish and Byzantine Art, and also a new book that I haven't seen yet. It's about a book about modern Jerusalem artist Avner Moriah that illuminated the Torah, and Shula wrote the commentary. Is a mutual friend of ours, and oh, and we have to praise Shula for coming today, and because she is in a very difficult situation, as I think many of you know. Her husband is not well, and we are really appreciative that you came, and we wish you Refra Shlema, your husband, and Shana Tova. Please.
Thank you very much. This one? Oh, the Golan. Okay, thanks. So I move this one. Okay, some time ago, I was approached by a representative of a delegation from the Chinese Family Education Professional Committee and asked to lecture to a group of Chinese educators who were coming to Israel to learn about the marvel of so-called Jewish and Israeli intellectual excellence and to understand why there are so many Jewish Nobel Prize laureates and so many high-tech companies in Israel. The delegation represented several cities in China where everyone works for one or two large companies, and the Chinese Family Education Professional Committee is responsible for the company's educational programs to ensure that the children receive the best possible education. The request presented an interesting challenge. How does one convey Judaism attitude towards education and its deep commitment to scriptures and its teaching to people who have no prior knowledge of Judaism or the Bible, who do not even have any sense of Judeo-Christian history? It seemed that the best way to approach the subject would be through images that could visually express some aspects of Jewish thought, folklore, law, history, and anthropology. My purpose was to present some historical background in connection with education in Judaism that would be suitable for such an audience and to be able to open a window for them onto the life and the values of Judaism. I spoke in Hebrew since the Chinese translator had just completed her conversion to Judaism. She met and married an Israeli Jew, and it was easier for her to translate Jewish concepts from Hebrew to Chinese. Today, I intend to share part of that presentation with you and talk about how what I learned from that experience applies to the subject of this conference today. Part of my talk today might seem a bit basic as it repeats sections of my lecture to the Chinese group, but please bear with me so I can make my point. The first illustration I chose to demonstrate the Jewish attitudes towards education was a picture from the Leipzig Machzor. The picture from a liturgical collection of prayer and customs created in 1320 visualizes the ceremony when a Jewish boy was to start school, a ceremony that is documented in Jewish sources from the end of the 12th century on. The three adults seen in the illumination are all wearing the special hats that identify them as Jews. The three scenes in the picture show children interacting with adults in teaching experience. The illustration appears across the bottom of two facing pages and adorns a piyut, a liturgical poem that rings with praise for the most important book in Judaism, the Torah, which is the special treasure that God gave to the Jewish people. The ceremony in Ashkenazi communities, Jews living along the Rhine River, was traditionally connected to the holiday of Shavuot, which is thought to be the day that God descended from heaven onto Mount Sinai and gave the Torah to the children of Israel. The poem written in Hebrew and the pictures decorating it are normally read from right to left, but looking at the pictures we realize that the three scenes should be viewed in different orders. Here we start viewing the picture from the middle scene and then move to the left to the teacher holding the child on his lap, and then skip to the right to the scene near the river. The viewing order and the meaning of the illustration is explained in the several liturgical texts that stress the similarities between the biblical description of the giving of the Torah and the details of the initiation ceremony when a boy was 5 or 6 years old. The texts describe how early in the morning on Shavuot, the child's father would cover him in a cloak or prayer shawl and carry him from his house to the teacher as seen in the picture. It is interesting to note that the child's head is turned away from the father and towards the teacher, but one of his hands is patting the father's cheek and the other is holding a round cake. The scene to the left shows the child sitting at the father's lap. The teacher is holding a golden tablet. The child has an egg in one hand and a cake in the other. 2 other boys are standing next to the teacher, each with a cake and an egg. The teacher has written the letters of the Hebrew alphabet on the tablets. He smears them with honey and tells the child on his lap to lick them. The cakes and the shelled eggs also have inscriptions of various verses from the Bible that the teacher would then read to the child, who would repeat the words and then eat the cake and the egg. Thus, the Hebrew letters that are the keys to the study of the Torah are eaten by the children and symbolically become a very dear part of them, as can be discerned from parchments such as this one showing the Hebrew alphabet from a workbook for children dated 1106, which was preserved in the Cairo Geniza. At the end of the ceremony, as shown on the right-hand side of the picture, the teacher would take the children to the river bank and explain to them that the study of the Torah is like the endless flow of water in the river, and that just as the flow of water is essential to life, so is the Torah. On the right, facing the picture of the initiation ceremony, we see the Jewish people receiving the Torah when they are told, "And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." It is clear from the juxtaposition that the initiation scene on the left is visualizing the obligation to teach the Torah and the commitment to study it. Moreover, the image of the teacher parallels that of Moses. The golden tablet is a parallel to the 2 tablets of the law that Moses brought down to the Israelites. The scene of the giving of the Torah is shown here with only 4 individuals, perhaps a match for the 4 boys that are seen with the teacher in the initiation scene, so as to emphasize the importance of transferring the knowledge individually to every child in every generation. The biblical story of Moses presenting the 2 tablets of the covenant known as the giving of the Torah is seen here in the Sarajevo Haggadah is found in many illuminated manuscripts. Obviously, the artists and their patrons wanted to keep the memory of this great historic event alive and current in every generation, and to stress the importance of educating the people to study Torah. This emphasis on the enormous value of education also finds expression in another major holiday known as Passover, the festival that celebrates the Exodus when God brought the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, where they have been slaves for hundreds of years. The Exodus illustrated here in the western wall of the 3rd century synagogue of Bar-Ilan in Syria is thought to have happened in the 15th century BCE, but the story is still told over and over every year, an educational experience for all the generation. The holiday of Passover is celebrated primarily at a festive family dinner called the Seder, where the family sits together around the table and tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt, reading from a book called the Haggadah. The name of the book is based on the biblical expression, and you should tell it, the Haggadah, the story of the Exodus, to your children, which is the commandment to transmit the Jewish past to the children in a stimulating way. The London Miscellany, produced in France in 1280, is an example of a 13th century book that includes the Haggadah in a rendition that shows children sitting at the table where they are expected to ask questions about the particular foods served during the meal and the special custom related to the holiday. This 14th century Haggadah from Spain shows a family sitting around the table with the children being encouraged to ask questions about the various symbols of the holiday, so as to give them a sense of connection with their heritage. Here, the Seder plate with the symbols of the holiday is being passed from head to head, a ritual that was designed to encourage the children to ask questions about them. The importance of asking questions was highlighted in a much more recent story about Isidor Isaac Rabi, a Jewish physicist, the recipient of the Nobel Prize in 1944. Rabi was asked what led him to achieve such great accomplishments. He replied that it was his mother who was responsible. Every day when he came home from school, she did not ask him what he had learned, but asked rather, "What important question did you ask your teacher today?" Jewish art from these early periods also related to another important principle of education. In this picture, we can see the need to set boundaries and maintain discipline. The rod in the teacher's hand looks threatening, but the idea is to transmit the message that education demands a sense of respect for the studies as well as a sense of humor. The teacher is urging the student to read at a certain pace with the hourglass behind him. The text he is reading quotes the words of one of the great sages, Hillel, who said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is essential. That is the essence of the Torah. Everything else is a commentary. Go and learn. The child is obviously encouraged to study on his own, but he is reassured and his efforts are supported by his family and community. This full-page miniature from the Sarajevo Haggadah of Jews leaving the synagogue, parents with their children in front of them, also include a view of the Torah within, with the men closing the doors of the Holy Ark, which contains the Torah scrolls. This detail seems strange, since it is known that Jews would not leave before the Torah is put back inside the Ark and its doors are closed. Thus it seems that the purpose of this detail is to point to the Torah as the focus of Jewish educational, communal, and religious life. As we read in the 5th book of the Bible, Torah tzivah lanu Moshe morasha kilat Yaakov, the book of the covenant of Moses, of the Most High, the law which Moses ordained for us as an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob. We find the same as an inheritance for the congregation of, we find the same verse representing the essence of Judaism in the 2nd century BCE work known as the Wisdom of Ben Sira. The interpretation of the later Talmudic and Middle Ages sources insists that this is the first verse a father should teach his son, as it underscores the primary importance of education and of teaching what was revealed to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. According to the Mishnaic and Talmudic sources, which interpret scriptures, a Jewish father is bound to fulfill the Jewish understanding of education and the rites of passage by performing his son's circumcision on the 8th day, redeeming him if he is the firstborn on the 30th day, and most of all, teaching him Torah, is found in Tractate Avot of the Mishnah. He used to say 5 years is the age for the study of the scripture, 10 for the study of the Mishnah, 13 for becoming subject to commandments, 15 for the study of the Talmud. The Chinese group followed the lecture with great interest, and their many questions made it clear that they had gained an understanding of the great importance of education in Judaism. The experience led me to the realization that Jewish art is essentially a visual language. that can convey many aspects of Jewish social, cultural, historical, and anthropological subjects at various levels. The picture of the initiation ceremony that I used to illustrate the Jewish approach to education could lead to much deeper discussion concerning Jewish acculturation in medieval Europe, using the research done by Ivan Marcus in his book Ritual of Childhood, Jewish Acculturation in Medieval Europe, by Catherine Kodman-Apple in her recent book A Machzor from Worms, and other studies as well. Jewish art could be used for a fascinating study of Jewish cultural and religious exchanges with the surrounding societies, as was discussed by Catherine Kodman-Apple in her article, Jewish Art and Cultural Exchange, Theoretical Perspective. Viewing Jewish art, we realize that the Jews shared visual cultures with their counterparts in the many countries in which they lived. It is important to determine the extent to which they adopted images or motifs that seem suitable in a Jewish context without understanding their original Christological meaning sometimes. How much did Jews share in Islamic and Christian visual culture? Would that sharing have enabled them to understand the visual codes used in the different societies? To what degree did Jewish scholars, illuminators, patrons, and scribes integrate these motifs into the Jewish visual language? Such questions point out the importance of researching, teaching, and using Jewish art for a better understanding of the Jewish past as well as of history in general. In her article, Images and Objects as Sources for Medieval History, Sarah Lipton discusses medieval images as rich resources for the study of a range of contemporaneous subjects. She contends that scholars have learned to see images not simply as illustrations, but as representations that serve many purposes, and that the study of images must rely on iconographical analysis through which we can learn a great deal about medieval society. In both general and Jewish art, it is important to look at which particular scenes or characters were selected for depiction and how they were portrayed. By examining the subject chosen for representation, we can discern that the then contemporary interest and concern. Interestingly, when we compare Hebrew and Latin manuscript, we often find the same artistic styles, and it is clear that they were often rendered by the same artist. This again points to the process of acculturation among Jews. To sum up, I am convinced that Jewish art can be used as a visual language to interpret written texts, communicate ideas, and reveal the past. That being so, it should be an integral part of a range of relevant disciplines and can serve as an exceptionally strong platform for the presentation of many Jewish and non-Jewish fields of studies, including history, philosophy, anthropology, biblical interpretation, and polemics. Thank you.
Thank you, Shula, and also I think questions to you, I'm sure. Our last speaker in this session is the youngest, but he still is very well known despite his age. He was my student, I remember. So, he finished his dissertation under the guidance at the University of Professor Zilam Shneimeises and Professor Ilia Rodov from the folklore department. So Ilia is really joining together these two fields, which I'm very happy for. And since he finished his studies, he's been teaching here at Bar-Ilan, and now the chairman of the department following Bar-Ilan. And he's also editor of Ars Judaica and I just want to mention also his book, for those of you who don't know, The Torah to Renaissance Poland, which is a very important book. Okay, so Ilia, please.
Thank you very much. My subject today is the art commonly referred to as Judaica, or Jewish traditional art, or Jewish folk art. This is visual culture comprising ritual and ceremonial objects, sepulchral and synagogue art created for Jewish communities in the modern times. This art is often seen as an accessory of religious rituals, acculturation of surrounding visual culture, folk fantasy, or mixture of all these phenomena. To recall briefly the history of the idea, the term folk art, as opposed to fine arts, emerged in art history and anthropology in the late 19th century. It happened under the influence of materialist theories of artistic activity, nationalist sentiment, and romantic belief that folk traditions had continued without interruption from prehistoric times to the triumph of industrialization. The adherents of national or social utopias praised folk art as a reflection of national spirit or as a creativity of simple people. The avant-garde movements appreciated folk art for the frankness and power of its genuine primitive expression. In contrast, the folk art was inferior to the hierarchic and Eurocentric models of art. A random internet search for Jewish folk painting or Jewish folk art returns Chagallesque fantasies, orientalizing stylizations like this, and even unexpectedly a depiction of a Mexican church, a portrait of Bob Dylan, or Anton Koberger's illustration from a German Bible Incunabulum. I would like to propose the deconstruction of the definition of folk as applied to the visual arts of the pre-emancipated and or traditionalist Jewish communities. In the limited time I have, I would like to focus on the synagogue decorations that flourished in Eastern and Central Europe from the late 17th century until the Holocaust and survived in some Jewish communities in the North America and Israel into the 1950s. First of all, what was synagogue art not? It was never a purely Jewish work, and one can't convincingly speak of its distinctly ethnic spirit. Synagogue art was rarely amateurish. As a rule, synagogue artists were craftsmen who studied their profession, which was their livelihood. Now I would like to go into more detail on these points. By their signature, synagogue painters and sculptors define themselves as performing a holy craft. This craft meets neither Alois Riegel's social concept of folk art as Hausfleiß, that is domestic labor, nor the definition of folk art as a mere hobby in pursuit of aesthetic pleasure. Just to stress, I'm not dealing now with Jewish domestic labor, which production has almost entirely lost. It should be noted that the Jewish communities rarely built new synagogues or refurbished their old edifices, so the synagogue artists could barely make a living by their work. Their solutions were: first, work tours. Some artists wandered between the new or recently repaired synagogues across the Ashkenazi diaspora. Yesterday, Tzviar Gad told us about the 18th century synagogue painter Eliezer Zussman of Brod in Ukraine, who worked in several synagogues in Bavaria. Secondly, a complementary job. For instance, a certain Joseph ben Eliezer, who produced the wall and ceiling paintings in the synagogue in Pinchov in 1741, served as a beadle in the synagogue. Thirdly, a broad artistic specialization. For example, in the prophyllic synagogue, painters of the Fleck family in the early 20th century Lviv managed the company for decorative painting and varnishing, which decorated public and private buildings in the city and beyond. One more example, Abraham Mendel Greenberg of Iași in Romania, who painted in nearly 50 synagogues, decorated also middle-class houses, public buildings, and churches as well. His contemporaries, Jewish woodcarvers and carpenters from Eastern Europe who produced Torah art in America, also applied their skills to carving carousel animals, as we learned from wonderful exhibition in the New York Jewish Museum. The production of synagogue art demanded professional training. Wall painting, wood and stone carvings, or stucco modeling demand elementary technical skills. These skills can only be acquired by assisting more experienced craftsmen, or at the very least by observing their work. Even the work of the part-time job painter, I showed this before, Joseph ben Eliezer of Pinchov suggests that he learned from others how to cope with the secco technique and how to maintain a steady hand in painting animals, digital ornaments, and Hebrew script too. Most synagogue artists probably received their training by apprenticing with experienced craftsmen. However, however, beginning in the mid-19th century, some synagogue painters had the opportunity to study in Kunstgewerbeschulen, trade schools devoted to art, or art departments for artistic crafts, which were established in European art academies. By the late 19th century, the Eastern European synagogue painters had integrated into the marketplace as decorative painters. They defined themselves as parlor painters, Zimmermaler in German, Malaje Pokojowe in Polish, or Zugravi, that is painters in Romanian. These terms are distinct from the definition of the artistic painters, Kunstmaler in German, Malaje Artisti in Polish, and Pictori in Romanian. The verse in Isaiah, Maaseya Dalit Pa'er, the work of my hands wherein I glory, was a standard conclusion to signatures of synagogue decorators. The phrase prompts the community to a sense of aesthetic delight and admiration for synagogue art. The token of artistic virtuosity in synagogue decoration was probably an abundance of ornaments, figures, symbols, and descriptions, as well as the delicate and precise rendering. The horror vacuum aesthetics weakened in the age of mechanical reproduction, using Walter Benjamin term. The naturalistically rendered images in prints penetrated deeply into the visual culture of traditional Jewish communities during the 19th century. Evidence suggests that the traditional communities followed the mainstream aesthetic of the urban mid-class that abstained from non-academic and avant-garde art. Although the synagogue artists lacked academic training in drawing and painting from nature, they copied the naturalistic images from samples, successfully mastering the academic style illusionistic depictions. At this point, I, of course, share Professor Sabar's enthusiasm for Jewish ephemera, which allow us to research synagogue art in the making. For example, the postcard on our right, utilized by Maximilian Kugel for his paintings in the Tzor Gilad synagogue in Lvov in 1936, reveals the channels and modes of acculturation of academic art in synagogue painting. Since some Jewish decorative artists tried their hands at easel painting, which they undoubtedly celebrated as a fine art, they likely considered their ability to manage naturalistic rendering as a proof for their professional attainment was not inferior to that of the artists with academic training. Returning to our main point, synagogue art was neither folk nor fine art, each of which might be created of the artist's own volition. Traditional synagogue art was based on a cumulative mechanism of selective appropriations of artistic expressions and techniques by the creators and patrons of this art. Rules for the creation of synagogue art were not systematically postulated. Although the Jews' aesthetic preferences were expressed through biblical exegesis, philosophy, legal writings, mysticism, poetry, and travelogues, the theory of visual art did not constitute its own genre. Unlike Christian theologians, Jewish scholars avoided declarations of or apologies for religious art, and we discussed this topic in several lectures during our conference. The halachic corpus neither provided synagogue artists with explicit instructions for designing or planning synagogue decoration, not offered more than a few recommendations for particular images or symbols to be displayed in the synagogue. It seems that rabbinical scholars were not always expected to be deeply involved in the process of construction, ornamentation, and maintenance of synagogues. The bulk of zoomorphic paintings and carvings, often naturalistically rendered, including several cases of anthropomorphic images, existed in thousands of synagogues of traditionalist Orthodox Jewish communities for many years without being significantly addressed in a rabbinical response. The exception does prove the rule, as a relatively minor part of this art was discussed. The response usually reacted to synagogue design only after congregants protested. Thus, it was usually the appeal for arbitration that triggered the discussion of synagogue art by the rabbis. Subsequent rabbinical rulings involved several principal criteria, forbidding the images which can resemble objects of worship and therefore may be associated with idolatry or Gentile cults. Fear that the images may distract the congregants from worship, and concern that a personal donation of a work of art to the community synagogue undermines social harmony. Even those rabbinical scholars who tolerated the use of certain images in the synagogue neither advocated their appearance nor promoted their reproduction in other synagogues. To summarize the remarks on the informal regulations of synagogue art, when the consensus regarding art ends, the tradition transforms. For example, since the late 17th or early 18th century, line sculptures in relief and in the round have been a token of the Torah arc in East European synagogues. The heraldic composition imparted the symbols of Jewish faith with a royal dignity. Jewish etiological folk tales trace the origins of these lions to the Solomonic chair of wisdom and so on. However, when translated into another cultural context, the synagogue lion images were no more tolerated. In Israel, for example, the late Rabbi Ovadia Yosef criticized them as a diasporic custom unacceptable in the Holy Land. Another example is the Mea Shearim Yeshiva synagogue of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Jerusalem. In 1954, Isaac Beck, Jerusalem-born Orthodox Jew and a Vienna-trained decorative artist, painted animal images here following the East European tradition of synagogue art. Nowadays, the images are frowned upon by the Mea Shearim community, who prevent any access to it by all those who are not members of the fold. A common method of censure is concealing no longer tolerated images. The removal of images from the collective consciousness rather than iconoclasm is a standard mechanism of transformation of the Jewish artistic tradition. The rabbis usually did not demand the immediate destruction of the objects in question if they were an integral part of the sacred synagogue building. Rather, they ruled that the existing decorative objects should be concealed immediately and that such practice to be banned in the future. A fresh example of the changing conventions is the carpet covering the naked geminant virgin figures depicted in the vestibule of Yeshiva University in New York. Professor Fine discussed this wheel of the zodiac, then uncovered in his Art and Judaism in the Greek-Roman period, published 10 years ago. All this is to say that the synagogue decoration should not be considered a folk art if folk art is understood to be a form of entertainment of self-touch amateurs. Likewise, the synagogue decoration cannot be considered a pure craft either, since paintings and sculptures were incorporated in synagogue design to imply meaning and evoke emotions rather than to solely serve utilitarian needs, liturgical or otherwise. Nevertheless, synagogue art may be conventionally described as folk art if the term folk is stripped of the parameters based on the media employed, the channels of transmission used, nationalist or ethnic concept, and economic theories. Such a redefinition was proposed by the folklorist John Benedetti, who defined folk art as the genre of art produced in culturally cohesive communities or contexts and guided by traditional rules or procedures for creation in accordance with mutually understood traditions, and in some cultures allowing greater or lesser attitude for personal expression. In conclusion, the Jewish art that we may define as folk, or I would prefer traditional, can be perceived as a non-verbal communication between individuals whose belonging to the same folk plays a significant or prevailing role in their self-identification. Traditional Jewish art maintains the cohesive values of the fold, either a pre-emancipated Jewish community or any Jewish communal group or conglomeration in modern and contemporary societies. Thereby, this art differs from the prevailing individual expression of contemporary artists preoccupied with their personal identities, such as those discussed by Dr. Miriam Reiner, for example. And finally, the said definition does not constitute any strict chronological, semantic, or formal boundaries of the field, but proposes a modus operandi for investigations across the field. Thank you very much.
תודה רבה. And I don't know if you want to stay, but we have time for questions, yeah? We started late, so I guess. So we open the floor for questions for the floor speakers. Who volunteers to be the first? So maybe I'll discuss with you for a second. I think my definition of Jewish folk art is totally different from yours, I think. So we should really maybe talk, because what folklore is in general and how it functions, I think applies also to Jewish folk art. And it's really the question of a work of art, or a work anywhere, and it doesn't have to be work of art, but the folk creativity is within a group and intended for that particular group. Is not something to be understood universally. It's, I mean, the definition of folklore should be first understood, and then the definition of folk art within this definition. I mean, I really think that some things that should be clarified, because there is really very little written on folk art in general, on folk Jewish art even less, and we need some definitions. I see that it's very imperative. We should maybe collaborate and work on it together, but really, I think most Jewish art is, until emancipation, is folk art, in my opinion.
Yes, I know your opinion, and I read your articles on this subject, and really I based my concept on slightly different definitions of folk art and folklore altogether, and we have just a very interesting phenomena when what we usually call folk art continue in the contemporary society. So I looked for another angle of view, and I'm not the first. I just based myself on some folklorists who offered another definitions of folk art, more maybe conclusive definitions that are more free from the definition of folk, which is per se very problematic.
Okay, so I think we maybe should have a seminar just on this question, I think another time. Other questions? Yeah, please.
I have a question for Annette. You don't have to. I was just thinking, as you were showing throughout your lecture, how both in a modern period and also in the medieval case that you gave as an example, there was a dialogue between what's happening in Jewish thinking towards what's happening outside, especially in the modern era, and Mikhail Vishnitser's reaction to the situation in Germany in the 30s when she wrote her book. I thought also a little bit backwards, especially in her case. Where did you find that there was any influence on her thinking and writing about Jewish topics connected to her past and her biography, and the fact that actually she wasn't German and she came from Russia and her husband was historian? Did you put this also in thinking about her thinking?
Yes. Well, Eva Fromowicz has dealt with her approach, especially in regarding founding Rimonim and Milgraim, because she was the first one to deal with Eastern European art and decidedly defining it as modern Jewish art. She was the first also to establish the reputation of Chagall, or discussing the impact of Chagall. And I think indeed that her background is very important, because she experienced a living cultural environment where artistic expression occurred in an everyday life, beyond intellectual discussions and political repercussions which we have in Germany. But what she experienced in Eastern Europe merged with her experience in Germany. And I think she was very, very quick in seizing what was going on in Berlin in the so-called Jewish Renaissance. And I have the impression that she redirected her of Ismael Bogen and others.
That she was influenced by what was happening in
Yes,
the Hochschule,
yes,
not
yes.
the other way around. That she
Well,
brought,
she made a proper impact, but it was also on the other way around. So I think this, I think her appreciation of iconography and tales, just to see the rabbinic literature as a fundamental for creating this whole world of Jewish images, this is heavily influenced by her background. But this experience of text and image relation is, on the other hand, is influenced by Ismael. So it's two together. And I think this makes her approach so unique and for me still valuable today.
and you can expand this also to other researchers that you were also later in America.
Oh yes, well, she has a very big impact in American history of Jewish research. It's nothing without her. Yeah, she is the starting point, together with Franz Landsberger. He is, I left him out because it would be too vast, but he as well is very important, altogether with Schönberger and Kaiser. So there is a whole generation of Jewish immigrants who founded Jewish studies, especially visual culture, in the United States as well. Yeah, I didn't go into that subject. It's a different way to go there. Yeah.
Okay, but I just want to add to what Annette mentioned, that her approach to modern Jewish art, but she was very negative and critical of Bezalel, and she would not include in Rimon, for example, any image by the School of Art in Jerusalem, which she didn't like, in my opinion. I
Because she
think,
was
because
also
It was also
It was a
concurrence
political-
with Ost-West. They were really two ways going in the same direction, and it was kind of competition between the two.
that's why
And she established the Eastern European
that's why
track.
she
She
preferred
wanted
that.
that.
She preferred
And
that
in a
to-
different way to Ost and
That-
West.
That's why I asked why, if there is any influence, if you see it in the work of her husband, who was a historian of
Yeah,
Russian
well,
Jewry.
actually, they worked together in regard of Jewish craftsmen.
that's
The work what she did and the appreciation of the visual art, what she did, was very different from Ost and West. But they had some understanding, but they favored people like Horowitz and others who were already in favor of the Bezalel direction. Whereas she said, yes, there was an Eastern European craftsmanship of Jewish craftsmen, which had their own impact and were very important.
Okay, so we have to, okay, so,
Yeah, I have a question for Annette
okay,
as well.
okay, first,
Yeah,
so Rihanna was first, okay, so.
Thanks. Annette, you have presented us with some very, very important findings of yours, which I think William has alerted at the beginning of the conference of the reinstalling of the ritual art into the area of art history. I wondered whether there is an evidence of increased training of Jewish artists at the time, which you have based your conclusions on.
You mean in the medieval or modern period?
In medieval.
Medieval, we don't know yet enough of training of artists, especially, let's say, for folklore or for architecture, but we only can see that there must have been an impact of concepts. Because, well, we can debate it. I think that the two-pillar concept of the synagogue building was a concept imposed by rabbinic thinking and was handed on until the 14th century. And if you look at the mausoleum, you always will discover a kind of a program. You have many types of representations occurring time and again. You have the tree of Haman, you have the Elmit Naseh, you have this, it's Akedat Yitzchak. So there was a kind of a program, and the question is, how, or the art for Yom Kippur, the Avarachamim. So we have kind of a program, and the question is, how was this transmitted, by what kind of incident. We don't know yet enough to define that, but we have to go in that direction, because apparently there was not just here and there and this one and doing this one something. No, they must have had a communication, and this was more just in exchanging motifs or something like that.
But the actual learning of the crafts was the main.
Well, this is an altogether different story. That's Sarit Shalev-Eni was dealt with in her field.
Okay, so we have now 3 questions. First Ziva, and then Eva, and then Sylvia. Okay, Ziva.
I think I think the lecture was very good, but I think the differentiation that you are now making between Vishnitzel and Osunres is a little problematic. In both cases, they are directed by where they come from. Osunres stems from Lillian, and it's going into academic art, but it does folk art, ritual art, manuscripts, subject matter. All of the things that she will later do originally are there in the way that Austin West presents Jewish art. She will do it chronologically, and sort of chronologically in reverse, as you showed, going from modern back towards medieval and into the iconography. But basically, the layout of how you look at Jewish art is already present in the way they built up Ost West.
Well, if you refer to the subjects, yes. Well, there is
Stylistic.
Yeah, but Rahabishin says no longer somebody who puts so much emphasis on style. And if you look at Ost and West, which was founded in 1901, expressed in the circumstances of Martin Buber and the Fifth Congress, so the artists were presented with a concept behind. It was to create, towards a creation of a new independent and self-related Jewish art. And I'm not sure whether this was the concept of Rahabishnitzel. I think she went into a different direction, and she says, there's no need to discuss it. It has been there already. And this was based on a totally different issue, and that's the interpretation of Scripture. And this, in my eyes, is her different approach.
Okay, short questions. We have 2 more, and that's it. So Eva first. Okay.
Short.
Yeah. Oh, brief. That's okay.
Can I bring this round to what I thought this session was going to be about, which it turned out not to be about?
That's right.
So, so we had 4 papers, 3 of whom were given by scholars teaching in Israel, and 1 by Annette teaching in Germany, and I teach in England. So, I mean, I hope we'll come back to this in the next session, but I think there is a fundamental kind of set of issues which are very different, which don't necessarily unite us, and which here we're sort of just bubbling under below the surface. And that has to do with, what is the kind of the bigger politics, and I think in that sense, the galut operate under in a very different environment. And so when we do research, we seem to come together.
Yeah, that's right.
When we teach, we are in very different situations. And this has a lot to do with, in a way, what are we talking about when we say Jewish? Are we talking about, because here in Israel, it's simple, right? We're talking about a nation.
Not simple, that's what we're trying
Oh, no,
to check here.
I'm being ironic.
But no, in other
Depending on the background of your students, it's not so simple, but it's different. But no, but she's right, it's different.
It's different.
It's not simple, but it's different. Yeah.
Of course not. So, whereas the issues, and so where I see this manifesting, sorry, I'll try and be brief now, is, Elisheva, of course, I studied with you, and, I'm familiar with your approach, this notion that, that there is a kind of Jewish tradition which sometimes goes underground, but which is essentially cohesive. It's what I would now call a form of essential Jewishness. Whereas, in Annette's talk, these are just quick examples, I saw the sense that no, actually, there is a constant dialogue going on, and action and reaction, and these are not fundamental distinctions, but I wonder whether they have something to do with the specific context in which we teach, and the kind of the background, the baggage which we bring with us, and that we have to operate with.
I think it's another workshop ever. That's what I'm seeing. Where the speakers have to really speak about these issues and the problems they encounter when they teach Jewish art. That's good. Okay, last question.
So I just wanted, now this is just a point of fact that I wanted to establish, that when Rachel Vishnitzer came to the United States, she was hired by the president of Yeshiva University to teach. That was her first and only job, really.
Yes.
And she taught at Stern College, which was a new college then opened for Jewish women. And as it happened in 1970, when they were discussing the new library building that was going to be put up in Washington Heights, where the yeshiva was, Rachel Vishnitzer became the consultant to a new museum that was going to be on the main floor of the library, which was Yeshiva University Museum. And the reason why the museum commissioned 10 synagogue models was because Vishnitzer was the expert on synagogue architecture, and she is the one that chose which synagogue should be chosen, which one should be modeled. And subsequently, a few years later, Beit HaTfutzot copied those 10 models, and by the way, never gave us credit. All the research, enormous amounts of...
Even Maurice Gottlieb didn't give credit, so don't worry.
Millions of dollars worth of research, like flying over the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam with a helicopter to get the exact shape of the tiles, that kind of stuff. But anyhow, I also want to mention, she was already in her late 80s. And the museum did have a chance to honor her before she passed away. And I also want to say that it was her husband, Mark Vishnitzer, who wrote at that time the definitive book on the tradesmen, the Jewish trades and crafts. Right. So I want to point that out because it's a part of history that has been long forgotten.
The Vatikim among us remember.
Yeah,